Hello and welcome to NABA Perspectives, a weekly podcast by the Norwegian African Business Association, or NABA, where we look at key trends, stories, themes, and issues that are driving economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Lanre Akinola, the head of content at NABA, and this week we have a special guest on the show. We're speaking to Sanjeev Gupta, who is the Executive Director for Financial Services and a member of the board at the Africa Finance Corporation. I discussed with him how changing global economic and political realities are impacting Africa, more specifically, why the world is increasingly looking to Africa as an economic partner and as a destination for investment. And crucially, we discussed why this time might be for real when it comes to the African growth story. This is also the last episode of NABA Perspectives for 2023. For everybody who is celebrating Christmas, I wish you a very merry one, and for everyone, a happy new year in advance. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we will see you in January. Sanjeev, thank you so much for joining NABA Perspectives. A real pleasure to have you with us.
Yes, Landre, always a pleasure to talk to you. I think we're doing this quite often these days.
Yes. It's still not enough in my book, but that's a different story. Anyway, for people who are watching this who might not be familiar with Africa Finance Corporation, who might not be familiar with you, could you just give us a quick intro to your work and why we're sitting here having this conversation about Africa in a changing world?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Landre, I personally have lived and worked in Africa for the last 35 years, to be precise. So clearly, everything that I do or everything that I kind of have a little bit of influence on, or certainly stuff that I feel passionately about, by definition has an Africa link, right? The current role that I have is with Africa Finance Corporation, which is a very interesting institution because it's probably Africa's largest infrastructure and industrial financing institution. It's set up as a multilateral, but it also is very unique in the sense that, unlike other multilaterals, it has a public-private shareholding, which means that we enjoy the public sector support, the government support, but we also, operate under what we call private sector rigor, because we need to meet the expectations of our private sector stakeholders. So our mandate is very clean and clear. It is about how do we find solutions. We call ourselves solutions driven. How do we find solutions to plug Africa's infrastructure gap? How do we find solutions to plug Africa's industrialization gap? And how do we find pragmatic solutions so that Africa's mineral riches or fossil fuel riches or renewable riches all is developed in such manner that it creates jobs and prosperity for the continent, which has not happened historically. So that's our mandate. I sit in the board of the corporation, and part of my job is to talk to investors, stakeholders, different countries, both in Africa and outside, try and bring the narrative to a point where people understand that there is work to be done, there is opportunities to be seized, and there is certainly a need for the continent to fit into the conversation around how we want to grapple the greater problems of the world going forward. So that's my job. Travel 20 odd days a month, and it's fascinating because in many ways, even after spending 3 decades and a half on the African continent, I find that the current times we are living in, like most times, I suppose, but the current times we are living in is particularly interesting and particularly relevant for hopefully a evolution, if you want to call it that, but certainly an African renaissance.
Yeah, You set it up perfectly. Before we get into that, the issue you've alluded to, which is really the crux of what we want to discuss here, is what makes these times so interesting and why it is that we have to have this conversation around Africa's evolving role. I just want to ask a quick question on your work, given that context, which we'll break down a little bit more. Are you getting busier? I imagine that like you've been doing this for 35 years. You've seen ups and downs. You haven't been with AFC for 35 years, but is there a material difference in the work you do these days? The African narrative is one that we're all constantly having to defend. We're constantly having to, field criticism about Africa. I'm wondering, are you anecdotally seeing a shift in the nature of conversations you're having? And in a way, the question is life getting easier or harder?
You asked me this question before, whether life is getting
I did,
easier.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to. I mean, it's a moot point, and it probably depends on the day you ask the question to kind of answer whether it's getting harder or easier. But the earlier point you make actually is very, very relevant, Landry. I never thought of it that way. But what you ask makes me think, and it makes me realize that indeed the work that I'm doing, or we've been doing over the last few years, has gathered its own momentum, its own, let's call it relevance, and to a large extent, it's almost like you're riding a horse, which till very recently was not appreciated or probably not recognized in terms of the role that it can play in the overall situation and the solution that the world seeks. So yes, without meaning to be too profound, I think I can safely answer to your first question that indeed we are getting busier and busier and busier. Some of it is self-inflicted, as it always is, but it is also because the conversations that different stakeholders from different parts of the world, or the conversations that stakeholders from within the continent want to have, has been so diverse, so varied, so let's put it this way, so visionary, or probably so needs based, and in some cases so desperate that you almost feel like that you matter. You matter because what you're doing, or what you're saying, or what you're promising has, as I said, relevance to the wider world. And maybe that's the difference this time.
And that is quite a profound shift. Now, let's get into this issue of why are these times so interesting? Like, you've been doing this for 35 years, Africa in and out. I've been doing this for quite a while myself. And in that time, it's, I would say, one of the defining stories has been this, for lack of a better term, this kind of awakening towards the Africa opportunity over the last 2 decades. If we go back to 2000, Africa was kind of comfortably dismissed by most of the world. There was nothing going on there except wars and poverty and suffering and all of that. And what we've seen is, first of all, the new partners, as they used to be called, what is now broadly called the Global South, start to take a different approach towards Africa. China, we all know about that. In a way, they kind of kicked off this trend in a crystallized way at the turn of the century. But now, the interest, as you've alluded to, is so diverse. Not a day goes by when you aren't hearing about bilateral agreements being signed with countries in the Middle East, the Gulf states, Asian economies, etc., etc. In the US now, there is renewed talk about we must strengthen our relationship with Africa. The EU is making similar noises. What's changed? Because to me, there's been a clear uptick in this over the last couple of years, where we were kind of cruising towards a situation where, okay, the nature of how the world deals with Africa is kind of changing. There's a growing appreciation that the continent isn't just a basket case, as unfortunately for many years and decades it was characterized as. But it's a part of the world that, one, offers opportunity, and two, is kind of important to where we're heading. You've already alluded to that. Things like the green transition, things like critical minerals, and the development of the value chain around that, and so on and so on. Why have we, in the last couple of years, seen this dramatic sort of intensifying of momentum behind this? Because it was kind of a slow burn. It feels like we're getting into a bit of a sprint here now.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting when you put it the way you did, because it's a matter of record that Africa was left behind in the whole industrialization evolution of the world, and it's a pretty big statement to make when I say that one whole continent has been left behind when the rest of the world over the last 200 years developed, industrialized, and prospered. That's a matter of record. What's also a matter of record, and regrettably so, is whilst Africa did not benefit as a whole, there have obviously been pockets of success, but as a whole, whilst it's not really been part of the journey, which in terms of human history, the last 200 years has been a period of unprecedented development, growth, prosperity, and for an entire continent to be left behind is a pretty big statement to make, and we should pause for thought to think, why did that happen? But the point, therefore, is that whilst that has happened, regrettably, Africa has always endured and has had to bear the challenges of the world as well. So on one hand, you haven't benefited from the joys of the world, but you've certainly been suffering from the miseries of the world. So every time there is a monetary policy crisis, when there is a banking crisis, or when there is a war somewhere, or when there is geopolitical tension, Africa suffers, which is heads you win and tails I lose kind of syndrome that's been our reality. And the climate agenda, for example, is no different, Landry, because suddenly we are not only facing the ravages and the impact of climate change, because emissions regrettably have no borders, but we are also, because of this crossfire between what is good for climate and what is not good for climate, who pays for it and who doesn't pay for it, who makes what sacrifices and who doesn't, the beaten up child is Africa again. Like, oh, we will decide when we stop our gas emissions, and we will decide when we stop subsidizing our oil explorations. But you, Mr. Africa, must not do anything remotely to do with anything called fossil fuels. So again, we're getting beaten up, whilst the rest of the world is still fighting over whose fault is it and what sacrifices they make and at what pace they make those sacrifices. And the irony of all this is, at least with the climate agenda, is that whilst all this is happening, Africa's forests, Africa's peatlands, Africa's mangroves are absorbing the world's emissions free of cost. We're not charging anybody for being the lungs of the world. So on one hand, we are providing a solution, but on the other hand, we are getting beaten up and also obviously suffering. Never mind the beaten up aspect. We are suffering at a local level with the impact of climate change, where rivers are drying up, rain patterns are changing, extreme heat is killing certain traditional crops. So people's food, livelihood, mobility are getting affected. So given this scenario, Landry, it is no surprise that there is a greater realization on the continent that something has to give. Now, if you then superimpose on that my other thinking, and then my other thinking is as follows, that because of the years of colonization and what it did or didn't do to the continent, it takes a couple of generations to come out of that time warp that you found yourself in, where you kind of looked for deliverance from the outside, because that's what you were conditioned to do for generations. So I think it takes a couple of generations. I see that in India as well. So it's not an Africa-specific situation, where suddenly the current generation, the current leadership, with the benefit of education, with the benefit of better knowledge, with the benefit of a diaspora much more confident and much more aware, is actually asking that, is deliverance ever going to come from outside? No, it won't. It has to come from within. And you only have to look at the history of the Bretton Woods institutions that was apparently created in the 1940s to alleviate the problems of the world, that in absolute numbers, we haven't alleviated anything. So if you kind of put it all together, it's no surprise that the leadership on the continent today is acutely aware, number one, of their own responsibilities to be something for themselves. They're acutely aware that geopolitics is such that if you don't take control of your own destiny, you will always be the whipping boys, and that doesn't help you. And thirdly, and more importantly, the sheer uh, uh, settling down, if you want to call it, of the democratic processes around which governments are elected and re-elected means that leaders now have to answer to a growing population. And as you know, the growing population of the continent is immense. I mean, we got a 1.5 billion people, soon to be 2 billion people. We're going to probably have the world's largest number of young people in 15 years' time. So all of this are, I'm just picking up random things which is all around us and trying to therefore buttress the point that that is what is bringing change, because change comes from within. And all these issues are building up, creating that fury, if you want to call that, certainly creating that energy, or certainly bringing that sense of desperation to be able to do things differently and demand that things be done differently.
I think it's good that you reference the climate agenda as an example, because I think there, in a very visible way in recent months, over the last 12 months in particular, that voice is starting to come through. That there is less of the kind of the asking or hoping for the world to come and do something for you, and I guess a bit more of a sense of some confidence and the need to have ownership over the process of economic development that I haven't seen come out of Africa, which is refreshing to say the least, necessary as well. But it begs the question, like, why is this happening? Like, what makes the current situation we're in conducive to that? Like, is this just out of necessity, inevitability, or is there more going on here? And what I'm alluding to, of course, is that we are looking at this reconfiguration of the global economy. And part of that is this global north versus global south debate that has very quickly now become one of the defining aspects of what's happening geopolitically around the world. Do you think that that is contributing to this? My sense is, and correct me if I'm wrong, please feel free to disagree with me, is that's underpinning some of that confidence, that not only is there the awareness, but also the understanding that it's actually possible now in a way that it wasn't even 3 to 5 years ago.
Yeah, you're not going to let me slip out of that controversy, or let's call it that
Well,
provocation, are you?
I hope these aren't I hope this isn't being controversial. Like, it just seems to me that this is
No,
it's
I think that's an excellent point, Landry. I mean, there is only so much you can do with self-realization and self-motivation and self-responsibility and answerability. The world also has to be ready for your greater sense of responsibility to be matched with support and alliances and what have you. So the point you make is extremely important. As I say, that nothing is stronger in this world than an idea whose time has come. So maybe the idea of a resurgent Africa, of a responsible Africa, of an independent Africa is also getting more and more powerful because of the geopolitics that is probably supportive of it. So the point you make is so true, that till recently, you essentially had a unipolar world when it came to who will you engage with to try and drive home your thoughts or get the support for your own prosperity. Then we had a bit of a bipolar world, with obviously China entering the fray and bringing in a very different perspective, a very different set of priorities, and a different set of ideologies around which they wanted to engage with Africa. And Africa benefited from it, right through the 90s, China's own industrialization and the need for it to be fed with the resources that it required meant that Africa by default attracted investments which it was not otherwise getting, right? Now, what we've seen over the last sort of 5, 7 years, or probably longer, slightly longer, is become a multipolar world, because increasingly different regions, different sovereigns, for different reasons, are wooing Africa in many ways. They're wooing Africa politically. They're wooing Africa for getting new markets. They're wooing Africa because they need resources, or they're wooing Africa just because they believe that by developing Africa, they can look after their own security better. So, whatever the reasons are, you suddenly have, and thankfully so now, a situation where at any given time, I can tell you that when we look at fundraising, for example, or when we look at finding co-investors into our projects, we are no longer talking about one or two or three regions. We are virtually talking about every major region and every major country in the world through their own sovereigns or through their own private sector, wanting to engage and invest, not just engage in Africa. And that is fantastic, isn't it? And that's the point I think you were trying to make, that that is one thing to say, I understand what I need to do and I need to take responsibility, and quite another thing to then go out in the world and see if the world is ready for that. Or are there friends to be had? Or are there partners to be had? And is there an opportunity, if we are smart, that is, to be able to enjoy the luxury of choice as opposed to the past oppression of lack of choice?
I would say that's one of the most significant shifts that we've seen is exactly that point you ended on, that there is now choice in this multipolar world, let's call it that we seem to be heading into. Whatever world we're heading into, what seems clear, and this now seems to be consensus even amongst those who might not welcome it, that the unipolar moment has come and gone, and whatever comes next is not going to go down that road again. For Africa, it seems to me that this, played right, is a massive opportunity. And on that note, I just want to kind of look at the critique of some of this, because one of the narratives that's come out, and we deal a lot in narratives in Africa and the importance of narratives, not just in Africa, it's a global phenomenon, but it's perhaps quite sensitive when it comes to Africa. And one of the narratives is that what we're witnessing is a new scramble for Africa. We all know what that invokes, right? We all know what historic era that invokes. There was an article in The Economist just a few weeks ago, I don't know whether you caught this, which the headline of which was simply, "There is a new scramble for Africa." And it basically argued that this is a very negative thing that we're seeing, that whatever benefits the continent might have had in the early 2000s is kind of now giving way to, unfortunately familiar geopolitical competition that we've seen in the past. What do you make of that kind of take on this? That this is just another scramble for Africa for its natural wealth, and that this is no different from previous phases of exploitation and punishment that we've seen.
Yeah, it's always fascinating, because I think let us just put in a few thoughts into our minds before I try and address the point you made. Let's just, for the time being, understand that the world is truly a homogeneous place, and the world truly is a place where we want betterment of all human beings. Let's just kind of assume that. If you were to assume that, then you would also, as any sensible person, look at what every region has to offer to offset what the other region doesn't have to offer, or what every region has to offer as a solution to the other region's problems, right? So if you kind of look at it, because that's how logically anybody would carry on doing what they have to do, then you see 6 or 7 reasons why Africa needs to be engaged with, right? If you're going to go the renewable route, the amount of copper, cobalt, etc. you're going to need, or the renewable batteries that you want to make, which requires so much more, that mineral and metal space, 40 to 80% of those are proven reserves exist in Africa. So that's one reason to engage in Africa. Secondly, if you are going to fight the climate change itself as a whole, forget about renewables, how are you going to do it if you are not going to start looking at developing Africa so that Africa's natural forests don't disappear because people are cutting it to use it as firewood, which is a fact, right? So that's another reason why you should engage in Africa, because if you can create jobs, if you can provide energy, if you can hopefully make gas the transition fuel, as Brazil did in the 60s to avoid cutting down the Amazon forest, then you have a chance of managing global emissions by maintaining the global carbon sinks that Africa has. So that's another reason to engage in Africa. Then, if you look at Europe or certain parts of the Middle East, if they want to make sure that the usual challenges that arise when your neighbors are not stable, or when your neighbors have economic challenges, if you want to manage that so that it doesn't spill over into your own borders, then that's another reason to engage in Africa. Then if you just bring in the manufacturing story, post-COVID, this buzzword around diversifying your supply chains, reducing global shipping, which is a big source of emissions. What's the point in taking minerals and shipping it 10,000 miles away to manufacture and then bringing it 20,000 miles back? Then again, stands to reason that go and manufacture where the minerals and metals are. And guess what? Bingo. The renewable energy sources that you need, bulk of the renewable energy sources untapped in the world today sits in Africa, be it geothermal, be it wind, be it solar, be it hydro. So please understand that a lot of the problems that the world is seeking to resolve, the solution lies on the continent. So why would you not engage with Africa? And that is why, indeed, the world has engaged with Africa, except from time to time opaquely, time to time erratically, and time to time by just pure exploitation. Right. So all we are trying to do in Africa is to say, change the word exploitation and extraction to actually empowerment and industrialization. That's all we are saying. We are saying what we have you still need, but let's let the global manufacturing architecture change. Let us bring in all the bigger issues of the world as one composite problem for the human race and see how Africa, therefore, is the solution. So if you kind of put it all together, then you've got to say to yourself that we have a chance. We have a chance because needs-based development. So I think you heard me saying this, right? That human beings don't operate on three emotions, right? Greed, guilt, and fear. So in many ways, the engagement with Africa has been a cross between guilt and greed. Now, I am also putting the fear into it, saying if you don't engage with Africa, then a lot of your problems will just multiply. It will not disappear. And hopefully that is going to be a wake-up call, Landry.
So I would agree with you that just on a purely practical level, if you just, it doesn't matter where you're from in the world, you analyze, okay, what are our issues, what are our challenges, how do we address them? One way or the other, that road will lead you to Africa on some level. And that has been sort of my thesis since the early 2000s, is that the nature of your relationship with the continent is going to inevitably change. But that leads us then, of course, to what I would say is the more important question here. And you use the phrase, we have a chance. Now, I'm assuming when you say that, you're referring to we as Africa, we have a chance now here to reposition how we fit into this picture globally. And I would say that in a very simplistic way, that Africa's role has regrettably for a very long time now been that of very extremely marginal player. Yes, a source of important raw materials that the world needs, but other than that, it's not really factored into the equation. And it seems to me that one now, the opportunity, but also the challenge is to understand, okay, how do you take advantage of this context that we're heading into now? How do you see that how do you see that dynamic? Is there a grasping of that opportunity? Are you seeing evidence anecdotally that there's the kind of the understanding of, okay, how do we act in this context to make sure that 20, 30 years down the line, we're not doing another podcast, you and me, where we're talking about what went wrong?
Yeah, there is a beautiful little story around this very eminent golf player called Gary Player, right? And Gary Player was once asked by some journalists as to why he seems to be so lucky at times and gets the right breaks. And his profound answer was, it's funny that the harder I practice, the luckier I get, right? And there's another way to put it that, they say that luck is when preparation meets opportunity, right? That's what luck is all about. So I think the opportunity today for African leadership to take charge, to get onto the global stage, to negotiate from a position of strength, to shake off the basic assumption that we deserve to actually saying we demand is some of the variables that is now changed, right? So there is a much more conscious leadership. There is a much more assured leadership, and more importantly, never mind the anecdotal evidence of whether things are changing. The factual evidence is that, more importantly, it has never happened, but it's happening all the time now, that we as institutions and we as the leadership on the continent are systematically looking at how to make our own capital work for ourselves first. Because nowhere in the world can you expect development, prosperity, job creation, industrialization just on the back of global capital, which tends to be fickle, tends to be altruistic, and tends to be erratic, right? So one of the biggest things that's changing in the African continent, and I hope that the pace of this gets exponentially more, is that yes, Africa has scarce capital, but it has capital. Yes, Africa has capital, but a lot of it is shipped outside because of the perceived risk of Africa. Africa's own capital is shipped outside. So what is happening, Landry, is institutions like us are saying that that capital should be used and can be used and must be used to develop and de-risk projects. And once you have developed and de-risked, then global capital will follow. And a simple mathematical equation to that makes it very, very, very powerful. And that is that if you were to build, say, a big railway corridor between one part of Africa to another part of Africa, the amount of money you would need to spend on risk, pure risk, to do the feasibility, the climate study, the technical study, the land resettlement, all of that is usually anywhere between 1 to maybe 3% of the entire project cost, right? But that's the riskiest form of money. And that doesn't get spent because global capital doesn't like that kind of risk. So if we can use our capital to spend that, which is a fraction, 1 to 3% of a total project, and bring it to bankability by spending, as I said, then you have a chance of bringing in capital. And we are seeing examples of that. We ourselves are living examples of that, where we go in, work with stakeholders, governments, private sector, look at what sort of transformational projects can create jobs, add export earnings, and create value addition at source. And then we take the risk of developing it, developing the logistics around it, developing the energy solutions around it. And once you've created that, then the capital follows. And that's why I think this time is for real. It's for real because it's being done not only on the back of a greater realization, but it's also being done on the back of capital that you yourself are controlling.
I like that phrasing. This time is for real, because this to me, this is the question that I grapple with, because on some level I wonder, I ask myself whether I'm coping here, that this time is for real, that we're looking at something that is meaningfully different from what we've seen before. Because my concern is always that we have, unfortunately, a bit of a history of false dawns in Africa, where it looks like something's about to happen. It looks like we're about to hit that curve where we turn the corner, but then it kind of peters out. And I feel like we saw that in the early 2000s and the early 2010s, where we had the Africa Rising narrative, and it looked like we were on the cusp of something quite profound happening. Then it seemed to kind of dial back when we had the commodities slump in 2014, 2015. And I've been really surprised that, far from leading to a reduction in that engagement that we've discussed from the rest of the world, it not only has it proven to be resilient, it has gone up quite dramatically in recent years. should we be confident that this time is real? Is the question I'm asking. I mean, you're suggesting that yes, this is materially different, and that's I feel like that's an issue, a point that is really important to distill and understand in having this debate about Africa today.
Yeah, I mean, look, words are words, and words can be catchy, but why it is not just catchy but contagious this time, if that's the right way to put it, is because the need for that is felt acutely, right? And the sense of betrayal, if I may be even more dramatic, is quite serious. That frankly, what have you delivered? And how can we rely on one narrative, one set of friends, or one set of ideologies, or for that matter, one sense of priorities, which changes from time to time, to dictate the future of our people, who are all, between the youngest populations of the world on average on the continent. So that's why I think, as I say, anything is irreversible when there is passion and desperation and confidence, if you want to call it, and all of those three are in abundance on the continent now. So I think, and as I said, the earlier point that you and I were discussing is also relevant, that the world itself, in varying degrees, of course, understands the relevance of the continent, not just from an extractive point of view, but from their own needs point of view, right? In every sense of the word. So I'm hopeful, and I'm not making a bland statement when I say I'm hopeful. I'm actually, ambitiously hopeful, because I think the evidence is there. Some of the projects that are being developed today, some of the value addition of primary goods that is taking place on the continent today, some of the geopolitical dynamics that is providing choices to decision makers on where they will bring technology from, where they will bring financial capital from, where they will bring new markets from, is quite compelling, and allows you to negotiate from a position of strength. So so that's what it is. And look, at the end of the day, if we fail, it will be a colossal failure, because the future of 1.5 billion people is literally riding on us making sure that not only do we get it right, but we get it fair and square into the overall global agenda of prosperity and development for all. And that's never changed, except that we missed out on it for whatever reason. And I'll make one final point on this, Landry, and going back to your choice of words, anecdotal. I don't think the world, probably, let's call it the Western world, quite appreciates the inherent resilience of Africa's leadership and Africa's people. I mean, when you talk of natural distress, or distress coming out of diseases, pestilence, food supply, uh, the continent survived. Continent survives because the informal markets operate, the inherent camaraderie supports each other. COVID was a prime example, where there was a general view that with COVID being what it is, and with the lack of vaccines and the amount of challenges one would have with the informal economy and how do you keep people separate, that the disease would have spread like wildfire. But it got combated, right? I mean, with very little financial resources thrown at it, Africa survived, while considerably more financial resources was thrown at uh, other parts of the world, uh, to try and keep the people safe and happy. So these are factors which tells you that you're dealing with a very different set of people.
Now I'm conscious of time, but there's one area that I want to have a brief discussion around, and it is in some way a bit of an elephant in the room. So I'm going to approach it carefully and subtly, but we've kind of hinted at this, that there are there are different perspectives globally as to what is happening and the the role that Africa could, should, might play within that. And you've alluded to, one set of friends, another set of friends, and you've spoken about global capital being quite fickle and erratic. What the question that comes to mind there, and maybe this is a way of approaching it, is global capital homogeneous in this sense? I.e., are there differences in how certain parts of the world approach the continent? Because it seems to me that the ability or the way in which you engage with Africa also to some extent depends on your perception of the continent. And I'm being a bit convoluted here, but because I don't want to get controversial. But the question is global capital homogeneous in its engagement with Africa? Or are there, let's say, different ways? Do different partners approach it differently? Put it that way.
Yeah, many years back, I read an article on, I think the FT probably, I can't remember, where this guy wrote, and it stuck with me, where he said that capital is like Goldilocks, right? It doesn't like anything too cold, it doesn't like anything too hot. It's always seeking the perfect temperature, right? And there's no point in blaming capital because capital is ultimately an aggregation of all our personal savings. So why would I want my savings to go and do charity when all I want is uh, greater prosperity for myself and greater security? So the individual expectations that your money will always grow, always be safe, is ultimately what is aggregated out up there in terms of who manages that or allocates that capital. So there's nothing wrong with that. The second thing is that, of course, the world is not a homogeneous place. It can never be. I mean, even within a small family, you can't have homogeneity, right? So how can you expect that from the world? So clearly, therefore, money talks. We know that money talks. Money is a powerful tool. Money has been weaponized right from century to control civilizations and power bases. So obviously, the return argument aside, capital will always, in some form or manner, follow a political agenda. I mean, it's natural. There's nothing wrong with it, right? Therefore, the point is that you cannot control what you cannot control, which is other people's money. But you have to learn to control your own money and decide how can you work your own money smartly so that not only do you make money out of your own money, but other people joins you because they think you're smart, right? And that's how it has to be. And that's what trying to say to you is how I see the continent evolving. Because you tell me any region, any civilization which developed, prospered, sustained itself, kept its people happy, if it didn't control its own capital and made its own capital work for itself first. It doesn't happen, right? So the idea that our reserves can be banked with American banks or Western banks has to change. The idea that our pension funds are safer being invested outside the continent than inside the continent has to change, right? The idea that we don't encourage our industries and our businesses, albeit owned by global conglomerates, from adding more value at source so that it creates more tax revenues and more corporate profits that stays within the continent is something we have to change, right? If we can't, then we have failed. Nobody's going to do it for you. The analogy I draw is a very crude analogy, but it probably drives home the point, I think, Landry, that if you were to look at the United States of America, just as an example, and if you were to say that 90% of what is produced and 90% of the profits are exported out of the US, then would the US develop? So any continent has to develop by being able to recycle and reinvest its excesses and its surpluses. So the tragedy of the continent has been so far that when you look at a lucrative mining operation, what comes out of the mine as profits, very little of it is actually coming back to the governments or the local ownership, and that has to change.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like I left you with a bit of an out there by linking the question to global capital. So let me throw one last one at you, because a skeptic listening to this conversation, might say, and let's imagine in our mind a hypothetical skeptic who's sitting in a part of the world looking at Africa, and this person says, well, okay, this is all, well and good, but when I read the news headlines about Africa, here's what I read about. I read about debt defaults, sovereign defaults. I read about a debt crisis. I read about governments that don't have money to pay for basic services or even civil servant salaries. I read about military coups happening left, right, and center. Uh, this does not sound to me like a part of the world that is coming into its own. What am I missing?
Yeah, look, the what you're missing, I think, is the opportunity that exists. But more importantly, what you're missing is the fact that there is already investors who are queuing up because they see it as an opportunity. And it's a bit like the gold rush of California, I suppose, where a lot of people must have been sitting, what must have sat 200 years back in their homes and thought California is too risky, it's the middle of nowhere, it's full of people who might want to kill me. But some people did rush into it and made fortunes. So my my kind of tongue-in-cheek comment to anybody who is very cynical is, you can stay with your cynicism. There are other people who are less cynical. There are other people who are more strategic, and there are much more people. There are other people who see it as an opportunity of their lifetimes. So going back to the choice question, that I cannot convert the many, but I can certainly operate with the few. It's called the coalition of the willing, and the
Yeah,
coalition of
yeah,
the willing, the numbers are growing.
it's growing. Exactly. You know what? I think that's a brilliant response. It's a similar response to what I would give, which is to ask a counter question, which is to throw the challenge back and just say, well, what are all these other people doing here? If this part of the world is not interesting, why are all these people here? Explain that,
Okay.
and then you'll have your answer as to what you're missing. Look, Sanjeev, we have to wrap up. We are, if you believe it or not, coming up to closing in on the hour. It's
Well,
been a fascinating conversation. There's a lot more to this, obviously, but I think that last question, that last response, kind of it sums up this discussion, which is, you know, there's enough going on now. We might not necessarily be that concerned about the cynic sitting wherever he or she might be as we were even a few years ago. And perhaps if nothing else, that's the big change, is that we don't necessarily have to sit and wait and hope and pray and beg for people to come. There's kind of a queue, and it's getting longer, and there's enough to be getting on with. Would you say that that's a fair assessment?
I think so. And the reason I say it is not based on some romantic idea that everything I say people must believe, but on the fact that there is evidence on the ground, but more importantly on the basis that a lot of the attraction is coming from the fact that domestic capital and domestic leadership is beginning to pave the way for global investors, not the other way around. And that's why to me, it's more sustainable. Um, you know, oh, I think the way to probably end this discussion is to say to yourself that there is a party on, and like all good parties, you know, there will be the odd misbehavior, and cops might have to be called in. But that doesn't change the essence that there is a need, there is a demand, and there is a supply, and therefore, uh, and the demography is in our favor in many ways. So hopefully, uh, we as African leadership, in a collective sense, can do what we know we potentially got the opportunity to do. And this opportunity didn't exist always.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all to play for. I suspect things are going to get more interesting, not less interesting, and even in the near future. And we will be following that very closely, and we would love to have you back on the podcast at a future date, Sanjeev, because there's so many more things that we could get into. So I hope that you will be able to join us again at some point to maybe pick up the conversation or talk about some other aspects of economic development in Africa.
I'm glad you didn't ask me about my conspiracy theories, but that's okay.
Well, we'll save that for a later date. That's for 2024. Thank
you very much, Landry, for the opportunity.
Special edition.
Take care.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Have a great day.
Have a good Christmas and New Year. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. You too.